talk with her, and like maybe a few days after, I'm like, no, I didn't. Whenever we're happy to be here, you can dine at morning time and in the public financial research fund program and activities, interaction, and behavior. We work with others, training, and how to prepare to dining technology. The first part of work is to both impact and doctor with impact.
I'll just use the lapel. Yes, the 14 and 10 is a reference to a name. You do not criticize dogs ever. So I'm Sharlene, and today we're going to talk a little bit about 3 examples around design and accessibility. So before we get started, though, I want to talk about kind of like just a baseline definition for design disability. I'm going to be using a lot of quotes from an interview someone had with Charles and Ray Eames, who are very famous designers, furniture designers. And I think there are a lot of different definitions around design. Right? So we're going to start off with design as a job. It is a job that's supposed to serve a purpose. Right? And like design, there's also a lot of definitions of disability in the world. Lots of organizations have different definitions. We're going to go with the social model of disability. The idea that any ability you have is really kind of temporary. Our bodies are just meat bags, as I like to say. They're all vulnerable to impairments, whether it's straining a wrist, developing a disease, being born with something that changes how you interact with the world. And disability is what happens when the world excludes you for that difference, as opposed to just viewing you as a medical item. Quotes, Brad Frost, he is one of the biggest mobile first developers. And then Stella Young is a comedian who is a disability rights activist. I think this highlights what the social model of disability means. You know, if I am with a wheelchair user and we are across the street, really no problem. We can both do that. If we encounter stairs, that's when the wheelchair user is disabled. And to be honest, as someone with asthma, there's only so many stairs I can climb. And with each set of stairs, you know, that list grows longer of who can or cannot make that journey. So today we'll talk lots about history. We will not be talking about best practices. These are going to be observations of things that have happened in history. So think of them as neutral value neutral, neither good nor bad. They're just things that have happened. So our first section, which is about function in design. So Charles and Ray Eames asked, is design constraints, right? Design is largely dependent on constraints, meaning without constraints, there's really not much to design. You're just kind of throwing things together, you know? And there's probably nothing more symbolic and recognizable in the world for a sign of disability than the wheelchair. It's a universal icon. Without irony, before the past 100 years, wheelchairs were actually a luxury item. In the 1800s, they were used as what are called bath chairs. So literally rich people using them because they didn't feel like walking at the spa. On the French court, they were also called roulettes. You won't find much about that because people Google roulette, you'll get gambling. But yeah, it was an issue of labor. They didn't expect people who needed wheelchairs
to be able to use them on their own. So it was limited to the wealthy who could afford people to run around with them. This all changed after the end of World War I. And there's a really good reason for that. You suddenly had lots of people surviving their injuries because of medical advances. But those medical advances did not prevent these soldiers from becoming disabled. When you talk about losing over 2% of your population, you need to keep anybody who can work, not just people who can work ideally, but anyone. So instead of using heavy wooden prosthetics, the Queen of England charged people with developing the aluminum prosthetic. And as you can see, it came in many different shapes and sizes, but they were all geared towards labor. And they also had an extensive vocational program across England, so disabled soldiers could pick up a trade when they came home. I'm talking about Britain because in the US, we were not so good about that. In the US, the government was not prepared for the amount of people who came back from war disabled. They didn't have jobs, and then the Great Depression hit. So the money that disabled veterans were promised was suddenly not available. They formed a camp outside of DC known as the Bonus Army Hooverville. These kind of shanty towns were so common, they were named after the president who failed to prevent them. 43,000 people lived there. It wasn't just the veterans who would march on DC, but their families too. And when the president decided to remove them, he used the actual army. General MacArthur came in with 6 tanks, and over 1,000 people were injured during the process. 3 people died, 1 of them was a baby. That was not very popular. So, but while that was happening, in Germany, you had the Bauhaus School of Design developing. You had Mies van der Rohe, Marcel Breuer. They were designing all these chairs you probably see around Chicago a lot in waiting rooms. This one is the MR chair. They also, started developing all sorts of buildings. There's probably nothing more recognizable than a Mies van der Rohe building in Chicago because he ended up becoming the director of architecture down at IIT. He was also considered a valuable refugee. So many of Germany's best designers were able to come to America and influence the design here. And in 1932, that was when the first foldable wheelchair was invented. If you really look at it structurally, ignoring what historical baggage we have, it's not too different in structure and make from that very expensive chair designed by Mies van der Rohe. And if we compare them side by side, the Weasley chair and a Weasley chair adapted as a wheelchair, I'm not sure there's a lot of functional difference besides one has wheels. Now on to form. So form is a really big part of design too. It is one of our most obvious constraints, right? And I think Eames, there are a couple by the way, they said it best, we don't have compromises, we have constraints. A compromise is simply when you say the constraint doesn't matter, or we don't need to acknowledge it. We don't need to work with it. So you have 2 designers, they're working full-time jobs, and they make this weird machine in their apartment on the weekends. It's called the Kazam, the exclamation point, it's very important, and it molds plywood. They also have a friend in the military. He's a doctor, and he mentions that, oh, these aluminum splints we have, they kind of hurt our soldiers more than help. As you can see how it's constructed, it's not really going to help someone who's got half a leg blown off, you know, and it vibrates. That was the biggest problem. The way aluminum vibrates, it's very stiff. Even cyclists will tell you that they would rather ride steel versus aluminum because of the vibrations. So they actually ended up designing this molded wood splint. And the cool thing about it was because it was pressed, it could have punch holes for things like bandages. And unlike the aluminum splint, it could be easily molded to the contours of your muscles. At that time, it was very difficult to mass produce aluminum that way. Aluminum as mass production wasn't really an invention until the 70s, 80s, and this was in the early 50s, as people returned home from World War II. And there's probably not a single piece of furniture today more associated with affluent designers. The Eames lounger. That shape of the molded plywood, able to be shaped to any body, including the Eames chair, all those techniques were perfected while Eames was designing that splint. But then a sad thing happened. Just like today, as then, taste changed. We started seeing homes being proliferated with these sleek wooden designs. Eames chair feels really comfortable and warm there, doesn't it? Hospitals kept using that tubular chrome that we saw from Bauhaus. It was affordable. The chairs you're sitting on right now are using it because it can be cheaply mass-produced and is modular. What happens? People started associating that very design element that was once cool with institutions and being disabled. So, need, that's the other part of design. That's part of the job. You know, all those constraints around form and function there's no direction without trying to figure out what the need is behind the design. So, one of the things I want to make clear, because by this point you might think I'm saying the military is an advocate for disability, they're not. Just like developers back in the early teens and late aughts weren't advocates for Internet Explorer 6. We just had to accommodate them. You couldn't say, yeah, screw 5% of our users. No product manager would accept that, would they? It was a force of integration, not awareness. And that's a really big difference between integration and assimilation, which is what we're going to talk about next with fulfilling need. Now, assimilation, a big chunk of it is trying to disguise and hide something. You know, Theodore Roosevelt's favorite pair of glasses was something called the pinch knees. As you can see, it doesn't even have a frame. It's just literally two pieces of glasses held together with a piece of metal pinched on his nose bridge. He can put it away. It's not meant to be seen. It's not a statement. It's just discreetly a visual aid. In 1942, thanks to the invention of polarized glass, you can now have sunglasses. And the military saw sunglasses not as a fashion statement, but as an advanced technology. Their pilots had an advantage over other pilots because they didn't have to deal with sun glare. And that meant you could wear glasses that weren't medical. At this point, prescription glasses were still classified as a medical appliance. Simply having a little bit of myopia meant you were disabled. And then 1978 happened. By then, so many different types of plastics and materials had been developed. Fashion was also getting really wild back then. But also, this is something real strange, because glasses were classified as medical appliances, it was illegal to make advertisements for them. I don't know about you, but there's very few things I can think of that can be popularized without advertisements, without familiarity. So, Cutler and Gross, they hand make glasses even today, printed the first advertisement for prescription glasses. You might remember Patrick Bateman from American Psycho, or if you've ever read the book, he became iconic for the consumption of the 80s. Well, Oliver Peoples was one of the brands he mentioned, right? All their ads were conceptual, and they were considered high fashion. By the 90s, it reached counterculture. I don't think you can really safely say something is embedded in culture till there's a counterculture around it. Kurt Cobain proudly wore glasses. He wore women's sunglasses. Lisa Loeb popularized the cat eye glasses. Christian Slater's just a handsome dude from that time period, you know? It's to the point now where 1 out of 5 pairs of prescription eye frames do not have prescriptions in them. 75% of the US needs some form of corrective lens, whether it's contact lenses or bifocals or even just the negative positive adjusters you could buy for reading at a grocery store. 75% of us need something like that. But nobody would think that needing a pair of reading glasses makes you disabled. But that's what integration is. It's when, instead of it being something that we try to disguise, it is a value-neutral aspect of yourself. You know, having blonde hair is not good or bad. Well, maybe that's arguable. And so, in that interview with Charles and Ray Eames, the final question is, what is the future of design? And they never answered it. And, you know, like, I'm kind of positioning that with us, you know. I think it's pretty clear, even just in 3 examples, that if you recognize a need socially and you don't stigmatize it, the function and form follows very easily, and it doesn't compromise the design. All those designs were iconic, you know. Where is the individuality? Like, that was another reason why eyeglasses became so popular. They defined an individual, whereas the wheelchair handed out in the hundreds of thousands looked identical from the army. So, yeah, that's it.
We're going to open up to questions. I do want to, 2 things. I'm going to hand you the mic if you have a question, and I ask that you repeat it for the live stream.
Sure.
So with that said, questions? Anyone? I'll be bashful. Yes. Oh, I had to remind myself.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could maybe just talk a little bit about your work at Morningstar and how you kind of came to be working around accessible design.
So the question is, how did my working at Morningstar lead me to interest in accessible design? Did I get most of it? Okay. So the cool thing about Morningstar is, like, design is one of the main tenets, right? So from the top down, design is valued. You know, we've always had a chief creative officer. We've through and through, design thinking is applied even at the business level. And one of the things for us is we want to help the individual investor. That is also a core part of our mission, right? And you just can't think of yourself as helping people if you're able to say, well, we don't have to worry about 2% people here. You know, as opposed to trying to get more money, since we focus on research, we're not thinking of gains, we're thinking of providing that research to as many people as possible. Our website is definitely not AA accessible, but we're working on it. Yes, we are working on it. You know, it's hard to do that with a platform from 1996. Speaking of old things, you know, it's just being in an environment where you feel like people want to care. I think it leads to interest in things where at other jobs I was pressured to kind of put it on the back burner.
Okay. Any other questions?
If you had the power or ability to change the way accessibility is handled in the United States, what would you do to make the standards for websites more accessible?
Yes, so if I had the power to change anything in the US regarding accessibility and websites, what would I do? Okay. So I would probably just have people drop the stigma of being disabled as bad. You know, I mean, if I had any power. Because often it's just, you know, like I'm reminded of when I first started doing web stuff, right? I'm at an office, an agency, they're working on their website, they make this blog, and the header image is 500 kilobytes. Now, this is 2007, so 500 kilobytes was a lot, you know? And I pointed it out. I said, you know, this is a really big image. I don't think this is a good idea. And their answer was, we don't want the business of anyone who doesn't have internet fast enough for that image. So I said, no iPhone users? Because iPhones had just come out and they used 2G, if you remember. And they used 2G when they were at the airport. So you're saying you don't want the CEO with an iPhone who's at the airport just reading your blog and catching up on things. That, you know, that really pissed off the creative director because, you know, saying that in front of other stakeholders, he's embarrassed. What can you say to that? And yeah, that is not the same thing as saying, well, what if someone has dyslexia? What if someone has a visual impairment? But I don't see how internet speed and an image, an unnecessary garishly large image, doesn't impact the content you're consuming across different disabilities. I just made that obstacle relatable to them. So, stigma. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, in the back. We're actually thankful that when people in the back have questions, because it allows us to get our steps in. So.
Thank you for this great presentation. I'm not from the design world, so I don't know much about design principles, so I did learn something this evening. But my question is more about, you know, this is an age of lawsuits where online retailers and, you know, anyone and everyone, big companies are getting sued for not having accessible websites and web pages. So I feel like the information is out there, but people just don't know where to look for standards like API 2.0. Is there a way to make this information more accessible? And kind of less threatening in terms of its language. So do you know of any institution or any entity that is kind of attempting to demystify the whole data thing? And make it more easier to implement, especially when I think about small businesses and I feel like I don't know how they are going to do it. So yeah.
So I think that's a great question. Is there a way to make accessibility, or are there resources that make accessibility standards more readily accessible for the average person? And, in another talk, Breitbart, Fox News, happened to be the New York Times and Washington Post. And that isn't because for lack of money, it's because they're cheap. Oftentimes when people try to make things really fancy, especially in web development, they inadvertently make it much less accessible. The simplest website where you just have text, if I made a website that looked like this slide, any screen reader could read it, no problem. Throw in a lot of buttons and interactive infographics and photos with links and carousels, and suddenly that's a nightmare for a screen reader unless everything is perfectly labeled and set up. But to resources, that's why, to answer the other question, I thought the best wish for me would be to drop the stigma, because if you just consider making things less difficult, if you make things better to use, unlike the fancy stuff, that inadvertently makes things more accessible. Like just having the big room here on the ground floor, if someone wanted to, get in here and they had mobility issues, then going to the third floor, stuff like that, and whether or not that's because you want to make more money, gets more attention than, a store that's a flight up. But whatever your motivation, the more considerate you are of others' needs, you don't need a fancy, book with the checklist and passing standards, to make a website good. You just need to think, oh, is this cool? Do I want this just because it's cool, or is it easier to use? We were just talking about that earlier, me and Dennis, about slides. My slides are always black because when I've coded, that hurts my eyes less. It just also happens to pass contrast ratios for accessibility. But just by saying, hey, black text on white screens hurts, let's not do that. Whereas with other presenters, Dennis has had to work with them, but they don't like the contrast. And it's like, okay, cool, you don't like the way it looks, but can people see your slides?
Actually, just to tack on to that, ask presenters to make dark backgrounds white content for a couple of reasons. One, we've actually received feedback from individuals who have attended our events and say, the white background is glaring, and it actually hurts my eyes. Well, if you think of it, why would anyone? Thank you very much. Yeah, they're like, okay, well, what is he saying? It hurt. I've had a couple of individuals who come up to me and say, that hurts my eyes. And, the last thing I want to do is hurt people who show up to our events. So I've actually guided presenters to try to conform to this. Now, not everyone does, but we try to cover that. Yeah, I'm so thankful. And I think I had asked a couple of weeks ago, and of course, you were busy and we were busy stuff, but when I saw it, I was like, yes! But there's another benefit. So you say, okay, so that was done for accessibility, but what about inclusiveness? We record, right now we're streaming to, believe it or not, we have a member from Kathmandu, Nepal. I kid you not, I'm so jazzed when I saw him join. But we stream this and we record this and we package it up, we'll take the slides and we'll edit them in so this way it's easier to see. And then we'll put out the captions and such. But this is much easier to see than if it were bright. We had Marcy Sutton, who's a accessibility engineer and developer with EQ, who's an accessibility firm. And she had light background slides, and it was just a glare. And I felt so bad, so I had to take her slides and actually incorporate them into the edited recording. But the people on the screen, they said, yeah, we can't see him.
Yeah.
So they just basically went on what she was saying.
They invented this for that purpose. Like literally, they invented this because bright hurts people's eyes, and then they can't do their thing. So that's why I jumped back to this slide.
Any other questions? Yes.
I just wanted to follow up on what you were saying a moment ago about kind of going with standards versus kind of doing custom things that are inherently less accessible. What's kind of your preference, or how do you kind of decide whether something, as a designer, like, is better in being custom element, I guess, as opposed to just being like a native?
Yeah, that's a good question. So how do I choose between customizing a feature versus using a out-of-the-box native OS or native browser kind of solution, right? The answer is it depends on what my team's, because, it's not just being considerate of other people, but developers, when they customize something like a scroll bar, oh my God, how much time are we gonna add to it? She's rolling her eyes. Yeah, and I'm really greedy with my time. I wanna be able to design fast and design more. And if the developers take longer to build something, that means less of my work gets to see reality, So that's just, it's being considerate from multiple angles. And then, if, let's say, they give the all clear, they're like, yeah, go ahead, customize the hell out of it. I've actually been working on something at work. It's, a card, so it's a little setup of how you sell a strategy, right? It's pretty easy to think of that for products like a t-shirt or a spoon. Here's a photo of said thing, and then here are the details about it. You pick your size, add to cart. It's a little more complicated for a financial strategy. So, yeah, it's been fun trying to figure out how to make this communicate complex information very quickly in just one little snapshot. So user testing, just asking people who don't even have a financial background, when you look at this, what do you think this text up here means? We've actually had people say exactly what we wanted them to say. We've had people get confused because something was just out of the way weird, and listening to them is really how we drive the decisions. There are a lot of things, I wanted to do as a designer, and if the user says, hey, it doesn't make sense, I'm compelled to drop it. The design isn't my baby, and if they don't use it, it's a bad design, whether I think it looks nice or not.
I'm so happy to hear her say the design is not my baby. That's so contrary to a lot of people that I've heard. We actually have a question from the Twitterverse.
Oh, okay.
I'm actually so excited. This is from Anna, I believe from Austin, Texas. So she asks, how would you make accessibility go mainstream? Like easy steps, some simple accessibility settings everyone, most people would love.
So there are two ways I feel like people respond to accessibility. There's making it seem cool, right? You know, like the iPod, the iPhone. The iPhone did amazing things for accessible smart technology. PDAs were not very good before the iPhone. But then there's also like solving for pain points. You know, like I can't think of a single person that likes Microsoft Word. For a million reasons. Designers hate it because we can't control the text. People hate it because it's so busy up there. And when you want to just do one little thing, you have to like Google search for like half an hour to find out exactly how to do that thing. And wait, no, that didn't do the thing I wanted. And then you start over again. And when you make something accessible, those kind of things, the pain points just drop away. People will pay any amount of money to fix pain points. You know, my partner really likes her MacBook Pro. I'm partial to saving money. PCs, though, PCs are not as intuitive in the OS as Macs. There are different accessibility levels, but just because it's simpler to use the Mac, she's willing to drop that money for the Mac. And I can't fault her for that. That's the whole purpose of my job. My job exists because people are willing to do that, you know. And when it's not about money, you know, there's also things like people, I think, joke a lot about how social media drives vanity. Instagram likes, Facebook likes. But the thing is, vanity is sometimes just a confirmation you're doing things right, you know? And if you're removing pain points in different ways, even if it's just like speaking up for people who don't normally get spoken up for, or helping them be more visible, that's even better. You get recognized for it. You will. I think people are worried that there's only one way to getting that recognition, and that's profit. But I think that you would be mistaken.
Any more questions? Wow, now they're
I was wondering if you have any tips for taking the stigma out of conversations on an organizational level, or whether it's in an organization or client group, because I tend to see two things. It's either we get there because we say you're going to get sued, but there's no like emotional compassion out of it at all, or they're there, but it's from the standpoint of sympathy versus actual like understanding or wanting to, you know, address things without the stigma.
Yeah. Okay. So how to reduce the stigma with people who influence your product or website or work who aren't there yet, right? Okay. Without resorting to you're going to get sued. Which is, you know, I mean, you know, I hate to use it, but it's a really good strategy. That is, to me, in my opinion, the only reason why the US government gives a shit about disabled veterans. Bluntly, that's the only reason. That said, the other two options, right, which is popularity or pain point, right? Those are two very good drivers when you're at the table with people in charge of your little product. Pain point, so I've done some really sneaky things in the past. I've known some CEOs who have that big office, you know, studded with windows. Meet them around the time when the sun is going to hit their monitor. There's nothing less readable than a really refined design on an LCD monitor in bright sunlight. It's very similar to this kind of, you know, display. You want high contrast because if so, You want that corner office person to say, other corner office people can't see this? You want them to say that, you know? Popularity, like my clients are advisors, you know, and they're in the business of being, hey, look at me, I have all the money. Don't you want me to make you more money? So they want to always appear competent, right? Huge pain point for them is when they're embarrassed. So you want to make sure things are usable for them, right? If I have a colorblind advisor and they're embarrassed and they ditch my software, that's 25 grand a year lost to my company. It's worse than being sued. Being unpopular is actually worse than being sued. You know, people can recover from lawsuits. You don't recover if your business loses all its customers, you know? And goodwill is a big deal, you know, like more and more as the competition and especially tech gets saturated, you know, people are getting really exhausted by people churning out the same idea over and over again with just slight differences, a tweak in the name, a different button over here. People are exhausted by that now. The only differentiator that's going to matter in the end is customer service. You know, I am with T-Mobile. They do not have any service outside the city, but I don't care if I have to call them. I would pay someone else to call Verizon. I would absolutely pay someone else to call AT&T for me, you know? So that's a harder pitch, I would say, to make. But if you can do the research, if you can put the numbers in front of people of what the actual retention, like this is where working with business side is very helpful. They can tell that CEO exactly what each lost customer costs and what it costs to get a new customer. The cost to get a new customer rather than retain a customer is much higher. They respond to that.
One thing I just want to add to that, I do think, and this is not only the executive levels, but this is your developer, your designer, anyone who needs to consider accessibility. It's a harsh word, but it's true. You hear the stigma of disability. Oh, you know,
of America, cash flow products and financial products. It was just amazing how often there were windows and opportunities to look at accessibility, and that there are still going on. I still have friends who work there for cash flow products. Until suddenly a few of the clients, these are big clients. So this isn't like us using Bank of America, this is like Apple and Target using an interface to understand financials, not just across the country, sometimes around the world. So these are huge accounts. So when these people start coming back and saying, hey,
you know, we have to have an accessible product. All right, because we have people working who may need to be accessible. So I'm curious, that's just starting, I know it's starting to happen a little bit in other financial companies, especially the corporate products. Are you starting to notice something like that at Morningstar? Are you starting to get feedback from clients? It's not so much the pulling the plugs, but they're starting to say, hey, we need to make sure that this product is accessible to our.
Oh, absolutely. So while our website's not very accessible, our products are. Because those are the products being bought by the said clients, you know, your Schwab, your Fidelity, your TD Ameritrade. We're talking, you know, like when we lose a client, one of those clients, that's a third of a team gone. Like literally, that is what they're worth. You know, and I think, you know, like this is where, you know, this is one of the things I have loved about working at Morningstar is I've been able to, you know, look at the same research our analysts look at. And when you look at the numbers of businesses that aren't keeping up, it's dismal, you know? The companies like KeyBank from Cleveland, they took a team, who did they buy the team from? I forget who they bought the team from, but you know, you have Adaptive Path being bought up by Northern Trust, or you know, different companies buying up these companies, these smaller groups of UX consultants, right? They're the ones who are surviving, and the other companies are going down. And you know, it's just very basic business strategy to say you want to be ahead of your competitors. You don't want to wait for your competitors to do something and you have to emulate it just to retain your client base.
I believe we have one more question. It was over here. And while you're going over there, we had a comment from Anna in Texas as well. She says, by hiring colorblind developers, etc., you could prevent bad design in apps and products, e.g. black and blue look the same to her. I mean, that's one of the richest things you could probably do is to hire someone with a disability to actually work on your website. Just so you know, the disability segment has the highest level of unemployment. So we have the supply, and we actually do have the demand to bring in that richness into our workflows.
I just wanted to respond to the lady who had a question about creating buy-in with the upper management about, you know, without resorting to talking about lawsuits and relying on empathy. I just want to share my feelings with this because we struggle with this as well. And what I find is useful is that most organizations will have someone in a new position for diversity and inclusion. Like if you have an equity committee or someone who's working as a diversity officer, you know, different names, but you get the gist. So if you make it part of their agenda, because disability is also part of diversity, and if you make inclusion, you know, in terms of digital accessibility or any accessibility initiative part of their agenda, I feel like the conversations are going to go much smoother with the upper management and the budget requirements will be more easily met because that's an emerging area and there's a lot of lawsuits and there's a lot of problems around diversity and inclusion. So making that part of their agenda actually really helps. And if there's a committee like that in your organization, if there isn't, then you may want to take the lead on creating a committee and being part of that, and then making sure that you have people from different walks of life in that committee, so including people who, you know, who are budget managers, or possibly your CEO, or the topmost guy in your organization, and then some people with disability, you know, so that they can also provide their input. So, yeah. Thank you.
Sharlene, I want to thank you very much
Thanks.
for your presentation. It was very informative. Thank you for attending tonight. We have to be out of here by 8 o'clock, so feel free to talk with your neighbors, introduce yourselves, network. Feel free to ask Sharlene any questions you might have. Thank you.
Hey. Thank you, Tina.
Glad I could help.
Oh, gosh.